The flame flickered for just a second before it caught. The crackling sound was drowned out by the gasps around her, the smell of burning hair filling the air like a cruel reminder that this wasn't a nightmare, this was real. She felt the heat before she felt the pain, before the shock wore off and her scalp screamed. Laughter. A sharp, jagged sound that cut through the air like glass. It belonged to him. The officer. The one who had struck the match, who had let it fall onto her head like she was nothing but trash to be set ablaze. His voice was calm, almost amused, like he had just played a harmless joke. "That'll teach you to walk around here like you own the place." She didn't hear anything else. Everything around her blurred. The world shrank to the fire, the burning, the hands clapping over mouths, the wide, horrified eyes watching but not moving. Nobody moved. Nobody stepped forward. Not the teachers, not the students, not the security guard stationed just a few feet away. She reached up in a panic, slapping at the flames with shaking hands, her heartbeat slamming against her ribs. She could feel her scalp burning. She could feel the way the fire licked at her braids, eating away at them like it had been waiting for this moment. And still, nobody did anything. A voice cut through the ringing in her ears, distant but sharp. A girl's voice. "Oh my God. Help her." Feet shuffled. Someone was running toward her. A teacher, maybe. But before they could reach her, a strong hand grabbed her shoulder and yanked her back. Hard. "Let her handle it," the officer said, voice cool, unfazed, like he was talking about a spilled drink instead of a burning girl. "She wants to act tough. She can put the fire out herself." The pain shot through her head like lightning. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give him the satisfaction. She would not let him see her cry. The laughter grew, spreading like a disease. A few students, emboldened by his power, by the fact that he was a cop and no one would stop him, let out nervous chuckles. A group of boys standing near the lockers whispered to each other, smirking. She could see it in their eyes. The unspoken rule that had been carved into this town long before she was born. The rule that said people like her weren't supposed to fight back. A hand shot forward, someone from behind, finally brave enough to step in, and dumped a bottle of water over her head. The flames hissed and died instantly, leaving only the sharp sting of burnt skin and the overwhelming smell of scorched hair. Silence. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then, the officer clicked his tongue, tilting his head as if admiring his work. "You should be grateful. It's just hair. It'll grow back." Something snapped. Her fingers curled into fists so tight that her nails dug into her palms. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw herself at him, to tear that smug look off his face, to demand an answer. Why? Why did he hate her so much? Why did he think he could do this? Why did nobody stop him? But before she could move, before she could find her voice, before the rage that was suffocating her could explode, a car screeched to a halt. The sound cut through everything. The gasps, the whispers, the weight of humiliation pressing down on her chest. The students turned. The teachers finally moved, eyes wide with something she had never seen in them before. Fear. The car door flew open. And then, a man stepped out. The uniform was the same. The badge was the same. But the expression on his face was nothing like the officer standing in front of her. There was no smugness. No twisted amusement. No indifference. Only rage. A rage so deep, so dark, that the air seemed to crackle with it. The officer, the man who had set her on fire, shifted. His smirk faltered. For the first time since this started, he looked uncertain. Because this man, the one standing in front of them now, was not just any cop. He was the chief of police. And he was her father. The silence that followed was suffocating. For the first time, the officer looked nervous. He opened his mouth, maybe to explain, maybe to lie, maybe to do what men like him always did, twist the story in his favor. But it was too late. Because the chief of police wasn't here for explanations. He wasn't here for excuses. And what happened next would shock everyone. Before we dive into today's story, let's take a moment to say something important. Plow of Twist stands firmly against racism in all its forms. No one should ever have to experience hate or humiliation because of the color of their skin. If you're watching this and you've ever felt underestimated, mistreated, or disrespected because of who you are, know that you are powerful, worthy, and unstoppable. Your existence is valuable, and your story matters. Now, get ready for an intense and emotional ride, because today's story will shake you. If you love stories with unexpected twists and justice served, hit that subscribe button and stay with us until the very end. Let's begin. The sun had barely risen over Brookside High School, casting long shadows across the neatly paved sidewalks and the rows of cars pulling into the student parking lot. The morning was crisp, the air still carrying the last traces of winter, but the students barely noticed. They were too wrapped up in their usual routines, groups gathering near the lockers, laughter spilling from conversations about last night's game, whispers of upcoming tests and weekend plans. It was a school like any other in America, one that prided itself on its diversity on paper but, in reality, held deep divides that were felt by those who didn't fit the mold. Among them was Naomi Carter. 17 years old, tall for her age, with deep brown skin that gleamed under the morning light and long braids that cascaded down her back, carefully maintained with the love and patience her mother had taught her. She walked with an air of quiet confidence, her posture straight despite the weight she carried every day. Naomi was one of the best students at Brookside, top of her class, captain of the debate team, and already receiving early acceptance letters from prestigious colleges. But none of that mattered to the people who only saw her as different. She had learned from an early age that walking into a space dominated by people who didn't look like her came with expectations. You had to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy. Her father had drilled that into her since she was old enough to understand. He knew firsthand what it meant to be black in a system that wasn't built for you. Chief Elijah Carter, the highest-ranking officer in Brookside's police department, had fought tooth and nail to climb the ranks, facing hostility and skepticism at every step. His name carried weight in the city, not just because of his position, but because he had built a reputation for integrity and fairness in a system that often ignored both. To most, Naomi had the perfect life, a powerful father, a bright future, and intelligence that set her apart. But in a place like Brookside, that only made her a target. She felt it every day in the stairs, the whispered comments just loud enough for her to hear. She thinks she's better than us. Must be nice having a daddy who can pull strings. Why is she even here? Shouldn't she be at one of those schools in the city? But Naomi never let it show. She never gave them the satisfaction of knowing their words affected her. She had learned to keep her head high, to focus on what mattered, and to remember her father's words, "They will try to break you, but they will never succeed unless you let them." Still, there were days when it was harder than others. Days when the weight of it all settled deep into her bones, making it difficult to breathe. And today felt like it would be one of those days. She could feel it the moment she stepped onto the campus grounds. There was something different in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. Eyes followed her, not just with the usual indifference or resentment, but with something more. Anticipation. Like they were waiting for something to happen. And then, she saw him. Officer Greg Dawson. A name that sent a chill down the spine of every black student in Brookside. He wasn't just a police officer, he was a symbol of everything wrong with the system. He had been patrolling the school grounds for the past 2 years, assigned as a school resource officer, but in reality, he was nothing more than an enforcer of intimidation. He thrived on making students feel small, on asserting his power over those who had none. He targeted kids like Naomi, the ones who stood out, who refused to cower. There had been incidents before. A shove here. A snide remark there. A random search that just so happened to single out black students more than anyone else. But today, there was something different in his stance, in the way he leaned against the front entrance of the school, arms crossed, smirk firmly in place. He was waiting for her. Naomi didn't slow her pace. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. But as she approached, his voice cut through the morning air, loud enough for everyone to hear. You think you can just walk in here like you own the place? She stopped. A silence fell over the courtyard. The usual morning chatter died down as students turned to watch. Naomi met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Excuse me. Dawson pushed off the wall, stepping closer, his boots clicking against the pavement. You heard me. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, whispers passed between students who had seen enough of these interactions to know where they led. Naomi felt the weight of all those eyes on her, waiting to see what she would do. She squared her shoulders. I don't have time for this. She moved to walk past him, but he shifted, blocking her path. The air grew thicker. She could hear the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel the way the muscles in her back tensed. She knew this game. Dawson was trying to provoke her. Trying to get a reaction. I'm talking to you, girl. The word hit like a slap. Not Naomi. Not Miss Carter. Just girl. She clenched her jaw, refusing to take the bait. I have class. Dawson chuckled, shaking his head like she was some kind of joke. Then, his hand moved, quick, effortless. And suddenly, there was fire. A flicker. A spark. The unmistakable scent of sulfur as he struck a match and let it fall. Naomi didn't have time to react before the flame caught. Before the heat touched her scalp. For a split second, the world slowed. The sound of gasps, of a girl screaming, of footsteps stumbling backward, all blurred together into white noise. And then the pain hit. Raw. Searing. All-consuming. Her hands shot up instinctively, slapping at the flames, but the fire was already crawling through her braids. A part of her brain screamed at her to move, to do something, but her body was frozen, locked in place by a mix of shock and disbelief. And Dawson? He just stood there. Arms crossed, smirk still in place, watching her burn. No one moved. No one spoke. Then, the sharp screech of tires. A car, black and polished, pulled up so fast that the front tires nearly lifted off the pavement. The doors flew open before it had even come to a full stop. And then, he was there. The chief of police. Elijah Carter. Her father. And from the look on his face, from the way his fists clenched and his body vibrated with barely contained rage, Dawson had just made the worst mistake of his life. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with something unspoken, something on the verge of erupting. Naomi barely registered the students around her, their shocked faces blending into a blur of background noise. Her hands still trembled as they hovered near her scalp, fingertips brushing against the charred remains of her braids. The acrid stench of burnt hair clung to the air, a sickening reminder of what had just happened. Her skin tingled with residual heat, and beneath that, a rage she had never felt before clawed its way to the surface. But before she could move, before she could speak, her father's voice shattered the stillness. Elijah? Dawson's voice wavered, his usual arrogance cracking as he took a single step back. Chief Elijah Carter didn't answer. His eyes, dark and unreadable, stayed locked on Dawson with an intensity that sent a chill through the crowd. His presence alone had shifted the entire atmosphere. The tension that had hung in the air moments before now felt like a wire stretched too tight, seconds away from snapping. His jaw was clenched, his breath measured, his fingers flexing at his sides like he was restraining himself from something far worse. Naomi had seen her father angry before. She had seen him frustrated with the system, with the endless battles he had to fight just to be taken seriously, with the way power twisted men into monsters. But she had never seen him like this. This wasn't frustration. This wasn't just anger. This was something deeper. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Carter?" Dawson tried to recover, squaring his shoulders like he still had the upper hand. "This is a school matter. Stay out of it." A slow exhale left Elijah's lips, controlled but dangerous. His next words came low, deliberate. "A school matter?" He took a step forward, his voice sharp enough to cut. "You set my daughter on fire." The weight of those words dropped like a hammer. The crowd shifted, students exchanging glances, some gripping their phones tightly, recording every second. Dawson scoffed, his confidence faltering. "Oh, come on. Don't be dramatic. It was a joke." Naomi's stomach twisted at the casual way he said it, like it was nothing. Like she was nothing. The sheer audacity of it made her breath catch in her throat. Elijah didn't move, didn't blink. But when he spoke again, his voice carried the kind of weight that made even the wind seem to hesitate. "A joke?" Dawson lifted his chin. "Kids these days are too sensitive." Maybe if she learned some respect, the next second happened in a blur. Elijah moved before Dawson could finish that sentence, before anyone could react. In a flash, he grabbed Dawson by the collar and slammed him back against the squad car parked near the entrance. The metal groaned under the sudden impact, and a collective gasp shot through the crowd. Dawson's face twisted in shock, then anger. "Are you out of your damn mind?" Elijah didn't let go. His grip tightened, his knuckles white against the fabric of Dawson's uniform. Naomi saw it then, the war happening inside him. The part of him that had spent years playing by the rules, believing that doing the right thing would matter, would make a difference. And the part of him that had reached his limit. "I should break you," Elijah murmured, so quiet only Dawson could hear. Dawson's mouth opened, but no words came out. Elijah released him suddenly, stepping back like the very thought of touching him any longer made his skin crawl. Dawson stumbled but quickly straightened himself, rage flooding back into his expression as he looked around, realizing that every phone in sight was pointed at him. "You're making a mistake, Carter." Dawson's voice was tight, his arrogance laced with something shakier now. "This isn't gonna go the way you think it is." Elijah let out a breath that sounded more like a warning than anything else. "You're right." He turned slightly, locking eyes with Naomi for the first time. His gaze softened for just a fraction of a second before hardening again as he turned back to Dawson. "It's going to be worse." Then, without another word, he pulled his radio from his belt. "Dispatch, this is Chief Carter." His voice was calm, steady. "I need an officer removed from duty immediately. Greg Dawson. Charge him with assault. Criminal endangerment of a minor." Dawson paled. "Elijah, don't do this." Elijah ignored him. "Have him taken in. Now." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, Dawson looked unsure, his mind racing through the implications of what had just happened. He had always operated with the belief that men like him were untouchable, that the badge on his chest would protect him no matter what. That he could do whatever he wanted and walk away without consequence. But this was different. Naomi could see it in his face, the slow realization sinking in that this time, he wasn't the one holding the power. Two officers stepped forward hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable, but they obeyed their orders. One reached for Dawson's wrist, but he yanked his arm away. "This is a mistake," Dawson snapped. "I didn't do anything wrong." Elijah's expression didn't change. "The cameras say otherwise." Naomi's breath caught. She hadn't even thought about the security cameras. The ones positioned right above the entrance. The ones that had caught everything. Dawson's eyes darted up, following where Elijah had glanced. His face drained of color. "This isn't over," he snarled, his voice low, barely above a whisper. Elijah's gaze was steady, unshaken. No. It's just getting started. As the officers finally managed to restrain Dawson, the crowd around them began to shift. Students who had watched in silence now murmured among themselves, the energy shifting from shock to something else, something Naomi had never felt at Brookside before. Hope. She exhaled slowly, letting the tension in her body unwind just a little. But something in her gut told her this wasn't over. Dawson was a man who had spent years getting away with everything. And men like that didn't go down without a fight. The moment stretched, thick and suffocating, as Elijah Carter stepped forward. The weight of his presence alone sent ripples through the crowd. He wasn't just another uniformed officer. He was power. Not the kind that men like Greg Dawson wielded, the kind fueled by intimidation, whispered threats, and a badge that protected the wrong people. No, Elijah Carter's power came from something deeper. Something unshakable. His fists were clenched so tight his knuckles were white, but his face was a mask of controlled fury. The air crackled around him as if the ground itself could feel what was about to unfold. Dawson's smirk faltered for just a second before he forced it back, standing his ground. His confidence came from years of impunity, years of knowing he could do whatever he wanted and walk away untouched. He had always been untouchable. But today, something was different. The silence was unbearable. Students, teachers, even security guards stood frozen, eyes darting between Naomi and the man who had set her on fire, between the girl humiliated in front of the entire school and the father who had just arrived to witness it. Naomi's chest was still rising and falling rapidly, her hands trembling at her sides. The scent of burnt hair still clung to the air, a sharp, inescapable reminder of what had just happened. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even speaking. She was waiting. Dawson let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head as if this were all some ridiculous overreaction. His voice came out smooth, calculated. "Chief Carter," he said, tilting his chin up. "Didn't expect to see you here." Elijah's voice was low, deadly. "I wasn't expecting to see my daughter on fire, Dawson." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a shift in the atmosphere. The weight of Elijah's words settled over them like a thick fog. The students were still too shocked to process what this meant, but the adults, the teachers, the faculty, the other officers who had just arrived, they understood. For the first time, Dawson's bravado cracked, if only slightly. His fingers twitched at his sides. It was a joke. His voice was too quick, too rehearsed. The match barely touched her. "You know how these kids are, always exaggerating," Elijah moved. Not with rage, not with reckless abandon, but with the terrifying precision of a man who had spent decades mastering control. His hand shot out and grabbed Dawson by the collar, yanking him forward so fast that the smirk fell from his face like shattered glass. The students gasped. A few of them took a step back, eyes wide. Dawson's hand instinctively went to his belt, but Elijah was faster. Before the officer could even think of reaching for his weapon, Elijah's voice cut through the air like a blade. "You put your hand anywhere near that gun, and I promise you, it will be the last decision you ever make." Dead silence. Dawson's throat bobbed. His breath came out short and uneven. For the first time in his entire career, the balance of power had shifted. Elijah's grip tightened, his voice not rising, not trembling, just lethal. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? You've gotten away with this for years. The harassment. The threats. The violence. And you've always had people to cover for you. To turn a blind eye." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "But you made a mistake, Dawson. You touched my daughter." Dawson's jaw clenched. He was still trying to hold on to the last remnants of his arrogance, but his voice wavered. "I didn't mean," Elijah cut him off. "Don't lie to me. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a plea. It was a command." Dawson's lips parted, but no words came out. And then Elijah released him, but not gently. Dawson stumbled backward, catching himself just in time to avoid falling flat on his ass. His face burned with humiliation, with the slow, creeping realization that he wasn't in control anymore. Naomi was still standing there, still silent, still watching. Her father turned to her. His eyes softened just enough for her to see that, beneath all of his fury, there was something deeper. Pain. Did he do this? His voice was quieter now, but no less dangerous. Naomi didn't hesitate. Yes. Elijah exhaled, long and slow. And then, he looked at Dawson again. Take off your badge. The crowd collectively sucked in a breath. Dawson's eyes widened. What? You heard me, Elijah said, voice steady. Take off your badge. Right now. Dawson let out a breathless laugh, shaking his head. You can't be serious, you assaulted a minor. You publicly humiliated a student under your protection. And you did it in broad daylight, with witnesses. Elijah's gaze flicked around the courtyard. How many people here saw it? How many cameras caught it? You think your usual excuses are going to work this time? Dawson's fingers curled into fists. This is my job. Not anymore. Something broke in Dawson's face. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. He looked around, searching for allies, searching for a way out. But for the first time, no one stepped forward. The teachers looked away. The students stared at him with contempt. Even the officers who had arrived didn't intervene. He had spent years making people fear him. Now, there was no one left to protect him. Dawson's breathing was ragged. His fingers twitched near his belt again, but he didn't reach for his weapon this time. He wasn't stupid. He knew there were lines even he couldn't cross. Elijah took a step forward. Take it off. The silence stretched. And then, Dawson did the unthinkable. His fingers fumbled at his uniform. He unpinned his badge. His face was red, humiliated, his chest rising and falling rapidly as the full weight of his downfall crashed into him all at once. He held it in his palm for a long second. Then, without another word, he threw it on the ground. A dull, metallic clink. The students gasped. Naomi didn't move. She barely breathed. Dawson's entire body trembled with barely contained rage, but he had lost. Elijah didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He simply bent down, picked up the badge, and turned to the nearest officer. Arrest him. Dawson's head snapped up. What, you heard me. And just like that, the last thread of his power unraveled. The same hands that had spent years terrorizing students, intimidating the weak, were now being forced behind his back. The metal of the handcuffs snapped shut. Greg Dawson was no longer a police officer. He was a criminal. And justice had finally caught up with him. Dawson barely had time to register what was happening before the cold steel of the handcuffs locked around his wrists. His body jerked instinctively, muscles tensing as if he still believed he had control, as if there were still some way out of this. But there wasn't. Not this time. The pressure of the metal digging into his skin sent a wave of reality crashing down over him. The weight of it, the finality of it, settled deep into his chest. Elijah Carter didn't move as Dawson was forced to turn, his hands now locked behind his back, the power he had once held over everyone now reduced to nothing. The officer standing behind him, the one who had been silent through it all, cleared his throat before speaking, his voice lacking any of the usual deference Dawson was used to. You have the right to remain silent. Dawson let out a short, ragged laugh, but there was no humor in it. His breath was uneven, his face burning red with a mixture of fury and disbelief. He turned his head just enough to glance over his shoulder, his eyes locking onto Elijah's. You're really doing this, Dawson muttered, his voice laced with something between rage and desperation. "You're actually doing this." Elijah's expression didn't change. His jaw was tight, his posture unyielding, but his eyes burned with something deeper than anger. Something final. "I told you," Elijah said, his voice steady, controlled. "You made a mistake. And for once, you don't get to walk away from it." Dawson scoffed, shaking his head as he stared at the students still gathered, their eyes wide, their phones raised, capturing every second of his downfall. He had spent years making sure he was untouchable. Years making sure people feared him. And yet, here he was, powerless. "This is bullshit," Dawson hissed under his breath, his teeth clenched so tightly that his jaw twitched. "You're doing this for show, Carter. You think this is justice? You think locking me up changes anything? I'll be out before the ink dries on the paperwork. I have people. I have connections." His lips curled into something almost resembling a smirk, though it was weaker now, thinner. "You know how this works. Cops don't get arrested. We get reassigned. We get suspended with pay. We walk." Elijah stepped closer, just enough that Dawson could feel the weight of his presence, the unshakable certainty behind his words. "Not this time," Elijah said, his voice so low it was almost a whisper, but it hit like a bullet. "Not after this. Not after today." Dawson let out another breathless laugh, shaking his head in disbelief, but something in his eyes betrayed him. There was doubt now. There was fear. And then, for the first time since the cuffs had snapped around his wrists, Dawson looked at Naomi. She hadn't moved. She hadn't spoken. She had just watched. His smirk flickered, his nostrils flaring. "Say something," Dawson muttered, his voice sharp and cutting, as if he couldn't stand the weight of her silence. "You've been standing there this whole time, looking at me like I'm nothing. Like I'm the villain here. You don't even know what real villains look like, girl." His eyes darkened, something venomous crawling into his voice. "You think you're special? You think you won something today? The world doesn't change just because your daddy decided to play hero. You'll still be nothing to them. To people like me." Naomi's fingers curled into fists. Elijah stiffened beside her, his entire body wound tight like a spring about to snap. But Naomi lifted her chin, her eyes never leaving Dawson's. And then, she spoke. "I don't have to say anything," she said, her voice even, unwavering. "Because you already lost." Dawson blinked. Naomi took a slow step forward, her gaze locked onto his, her presence no longer just that of a girl who had been hurt but of someone who had survived. "I could say a lot of things to you," she continued, her voice carrying through the courtyard, past the students, past the teachers, past the entire world watching. "I could tell you how I spent my whole life knowing men like you exist. I could tell you that I saw this coming the first time you looked at me like I was less than you. I could tell you that no matter what happens next, you will never, ever have that kind of power over me again." She tilted her head, her braids shifting against her shoulders, her expression unshaken. "But I don't have to. Because from now on, every time you look in the mirror, you'll remember today." Dawson's jaw tightened. Naomi's eyes didn't waver. "Every time you think about the way people used to fear you, you'll remember how they watched you fall." A muscle in Dawson's cheek twitched. "And every time you open your mouth to say something, to defend yourself, to claim this was just a misunderstanding, just a joke, you'll remember that the world saw what you are," Naomi finished, her voice steady. "And they'll never unsee it." For the first time, Dawson had no response. No threats. No deflections. No smirking remarks. Just silence. The officer holding his cuffs gave him a slight nudge. "Let's go." Dawson's feet barely moved at first, his body locked in place. But then, he walked. Past the students. Past the teachers. Past the girl whose life he had tried to ruin. And no one looked away. They watched. As Greg Dawson, once the most feared man on this campus, was led away in handcuffs. Elijah exhaled, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He turned to Naomi, his eyes searching her face, looking for something, anything, that told him she was okay. Naomi met his gaze. And for the first time since this all began, she let out a slow breath. Not in relief. Not in victory. But because for the first time in a long, long time, she felt free. The tension still hung in the air, thick and heavy, long after Greg Dawson had disappeared from sight. The courtyard, once filled with gasps and hushed whispers, remained eerily silent. The students who had gathered, drawn in by the spectacle of watching a man like Dawson fall, were still standing in place, their eyes darting between Naomi and the spot where their school's so-called enforcer had just been led away in handcuffs. Naomi felt the weight of those stares pressing against her, their collective shock and unspoken thoughts crowding in around her like an invisible force. Some of them had laughed at her before. Some of them had whispered behind her back, dismissed her, treated her as if she was nothing. Now, they looked at her like she was something else entirely. Not just a girl who had been hurt, but the girl who had survived. She exhaled slowly, forcing her fingers to unclench, trying to shake off the tremors that still lingered in her hands. The scent of burnt hair was still thick in her nose, refusing to let her forget how close she had been to something far worse. The moment still played in her mind in flashes, the sharp heat, the stunned silence, the smirk on Dawson's face before he realized that for once, he wasn't the one holding all the power. Her father had been watching her, his expression unreadable, his stance still tense as if his body hadn't fully accepted that it was over. Elijah Carter had spent his entire career keeping his emotions in check, controlling the way people saw him, never giving them an opportunity to twist his reactions into a weapon against him. But Naomi knew him better than anyone. She could see the war raging behind his eyes. The restraint. The fury. The fear he hadn't allowed himself to show while everything was unfolding. He took a slow step toward her, his voice low, deliberate. "Are you hurt?" Naomi shook her head, but she could still feel the sting where the fire had licked her scalp, where the flames had threatened to consume more than just her hair. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice sounded distant even to her own ears. Elijah studied her for a long moment before he finally nodded, but his expression didn't soften. If anything, the lines around his mouth deepened, his jaw still tight with the kind of tension that wouldn't fade easily. He turned his attention to the principal, who had finally stepped out from the sidelines where he had been lingering, looking as if he had just realized that doing nothing had been the worst possible decision he could have made. Elijah's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, sharp and unyielding. "How long has this been happening?" Principal Marshall shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat as if he were about to choose his words carefully. He was a man who had spent his career maintaining a fragile balance, one where he avoided conflict as much as possible. He wasn't used to being put in a position where he had no way out. "Chief Carter, Elijah took a step closer, and whatever excuse Marshall had been about to give died in his throat. "Don't lie to me," Elijah said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "You knew what kind of man Dawson was. You let him work here. You let him terrorize these kids. My daughter. And you didn't do a damn thing about it." Marshall swallowed, his face paling under the weight of Elijah's words. He glanced around, as if searching for support, but there was none. Not from the teachers who had been complicit in their silence. Not from the students who had been victims of the same system that had protected Dawson for years. Finally, his shoulders slumped, and when he spoke, his voice lacked the authority he usually carried. I didn't know it was this bad." Elijah let out a humorless laugh, his head shaking as if he could barely believe what he was hearing. "That's the problem, isn't it? People like you never know until it's too late. And then you pretend to be shocked. But you knew. You just didn't care enough to stop it." Marshall looked like he wanted to protest, like he wanted to salvage what little authority he had left, but there was nothing he could say. Nothing that would make this go away. Naomi finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "How many complaints did you ignore?" Marshall flinched. Naomi had never directly confronted him before, had never forced him to look her in the eye and answer for his inaction. But now, standing in front of him, with the weight of everything that had just happened still pressing against her skin, she saw the exact moment he realized that he wasn't just part of the problem, he was the problem. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then, a voice broke through the crowd. "I complained." Naomi turned her head sharply, and so did her father. It was Jamal Wright, one of the only other black students at Brookside. He had always been quiet, kept to himself, never drawn attention to the way he was treated. But now, he stood tall, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his expression unreadable. "I told the school about him last year," Jamal continued, his voice steady, even as anger simmered just beneath the surface. "When he shoved me against a locker and called me a thug. I reported it. They said they'd look into it." His eyes flicked to Marshall. "They never did." Another voice spoke up. "So did I." And another. And another. One by one, students stepped forward, voices rising, revealing just how long Dawson's reign of terror had gone unchecked. Stories of harassment, of threats, of humiliations that had been swept under the rug. Naomi felt her chest tighten, her nails digging into her palms. She had always known it wasn't just her. But hearing it, really hearing it, made her stomach churn with something between fury and exhaustion. Elijah turned back to Marshall, his eyes cold, unforgiving. "How many complaints did you ignore?" he repeated Naomi's question. Marshall had no answer. Because there was no excuse that would be enough. The weight of the moment finally broke him. He let out a long breath, his shoulders slumping. Then, as if he knew his next words wouldn't matter, he said them anyway. "I'll resign." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Elijah didn't react. He just stared at the man in front of him, the man who had allowed all of this to happen, and then he nodded once. "Good." The crowd was still lingering, but the moment was shifting. Teachers were speaking in hushed voices, students were still trying to process what had just happened. But Naomi wasn't thinking about Marshall anymore. She was thinking about what came next. Because Dawson was gone. But this fight? It was far from over. The weight of what had just happened was settling into every crack of the moment, thick and suffocating, pressing against the lungs of everyone who had stood witness to it. The courtyard, though still crowded, had taken on an eerie silence. The spectacle had ended, but no one seemed ready to leave. It was as if the weight of justice, something so rarely seen in real time, was too heavy for them to simply walk away from. Naomi could still feel the sting of the fire on her scalp, the phantom sensation of the heat licking at her skin, the acrid smell of burnt hair clinging to the air like a cruel reminder of how close she had been to becoming just another story, another statistic, another name whispered in anger but quickly forgotten by those who had the privilege to forget. The students who had stood watching as Dawson had done the unthinkable were now watching her with a different kind of intensity. Some of them, the ones who had laughed at her before, who had whispered about her behind her back, who had made her existence at this school a slow, suffocating battle, now looked at her as if they didn't know who she was. As if standing there, unbroken, had transformed her into something beyond what they could comprehend. Others, those who had suffered in silence alongside her, those who had seen Dawson for exactly what he was but had been too afraid to speak, now held something new in their eyes, recognition, understanding, and for the first time, the smallest flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. But Naomi wasn't thinking about them. Not now. Not yet. Her focus was locked on her father, on the tension in his shoulders, on the way his fists were still clenched at his sides, as if his body hadn't yet accepted that the fight was over. Elijah Carter had spent a lifetime mastering restraint, had learned how to exist in a system designed to break men like him, had perfected the ability to hold his anger beneath the surface no matter how much it burned. But Naomi knew him better than anyone. And she could see it, he was still holding back. The storm inside him had not yet passed. He had won the battle, but the war was still raging in his chest. His breathing was steady, controlled, but there was something lethal in the way his gaze remained locked in the direction where Dawson had been led away, as if he needed to remind himself that the man was really gone, that he had truly lost. Naomi felt something inside her twist at the sight of it. She had spent so much of her life idolizing her father, admiring his strength, his unwavering morality, the way he had carved out his place in a world that had done everything to deny it to him. But now, looking at him, she realized something else. He wasn't just angry at Dawson. He was angry at the system that had allowed Dawson to exist in the first place. She inhaled sharply, trying to steady herself, trying to push past the whirlwind of emotions crashing against her ribs. But she couldn't ignore the question clawing at the back of her throat, the one she already knew the answer to but needed to hear out loud. Her voice was quieter than she expected when she finally spoke, but the weight behind it was undeniable. "He'll be out on bail, won't he?" Elijah turned to her slowly, and for the first time, Naomi saw it, the exhaustion buried beneath all of his fury. It was deeper than today, deeper than Dawson, deeper than anything that had happened in the past few hours. This was the exhaustion of a man who had been fighting his entire life, who had carried the burden of justice on his shoulders for decades, who had been forced to play by rules that had never been designed for men like him to win. His jaw tightened, his expression unreadable, but when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, certain. "Maybe. But not back here. Not back in uniform. Not back in power." Naomi's fingers curled into fists at her sides, nails digging into her palms. It should have been enough. Knowing that Dawson had lost everything, that his career was over, that he would wake up every morning knowing that he had finally been held accountable for something. It should have been enough. But it wasn't. Because even as she stood there, surrounded by people who had once ignored her suffering, who had once laughed at her pain, she knew the truth: Dawson was only one man. He had been removed from his throne, but the system that had built it for him was still standing. She could feel it in the way the teachers looked away, in the way Principal Marshall was still lingering on the outskirts of the crowd, his face pale, his lips pressed into a thin, uncertain line. They were afraid. Not of what had happened, but of what would come next. Jamal took a step forward then, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "It's not just him." Elijah shifted his gaze, his expression unreadable. "I know." "No," Jamal pressed, shaking his head. "I don't think you do. This school. This town. It let him get away with it for years. He wasn't the only one. He was just the loudest." A murmur ran through the students, a ripple of truth moving through them as if Jamal had given them permission to acknowledge what had always been right in front of them. Naomi felt her chest tighten, her heartbeat quicken. He was right. Dawson was gone, but the problem wasn't. She turned back to her father, her voice steady but full of something new, something that hadn't been there before. "So what now?" Elijah exhaled slowly, glancing around at the faces watching him, at the teachers who were still too afraid to speak, at Marshall, who looked like he was debating whether or not he could disappear into the ground. Finally, Elijah turned back to Naomi, his voice low but certain. "Now," he said, "we make sure this doesn't happen again." Marshall straightened slightly, as if realizing he was about to become part of the conversation whether he liked it or not. His voice, though weak, carried an air of desperate self-preservation. "Chief Carter, I already said I would resign." Elijah didn't even spare him a glance. "This was bigger than you. And it's going to take more than one resignation to fix it." Naomi saw the way Marshall's face crumpled, the way his shoulders slumped under the weight of what he had allowed to fester under his watch. But she didn't feel sorry for him. She didn't feel sorry for any of them. The ones who had looked away, the ones who had accepted Dawson's cruelty as part of the fabric of this school, this town. The ones who had let people like her suffer in silence because it was easier than standing up. Jamal nodded, his jaw tight. So what do we do? For the first time since this all started, Naomi felt something shift inside her. A spark of something other than anger, other than pain. She met Jamal's gaze, then glanced at the students still standing in stunned silence. They had all seen it now. The ones who had stayed quiet before. The ones who had accepted things as they were. They couldn't pretend anymore. She turned back to her father, her voice steady. We don't stop. Elijah studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing through his expression. Then, slowly, he nodded. You sure you're ready for that? Naomi didn't hesitate. Yes. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't just going to survive. She was going to change everything. The weight of everything that had just unfolded still hung in the air like a thick, suffocating fog, wrapping itself around every person still lingering in the courtyard. The silence wasn't the kind that came after a disruption, it was the kind that settled in when people realized they had just witnessed something that could not be undone, something that had shifted the very ground beneath their feet. The faces staring back at Naomi, at Elijah, at the spot where Dawson had been dragged away, were a mixture of disbelief, realization, and something else, something unspoken, something heavy. Naomi could feel the intensity of it pressing against her skin, the way people were looking at her now as if she had become something different, something more than what she was before. Some of them had known her since elementary school, had walked the same hallways as her, had laughed at her, whispered about her, excluded her from things they never thought twice about. They had built this world where people like her had to fight for every inch, and now, they were finally realizing that she had been fighting this entire time. But she wasn't thinking about them. Not now. Not after everything that had just happened. Her mind was still caught in the storm, in the echoes of Dawson's last words, in the way his smirk had faltered the moment he realized he had truly lost. It should have felt like victory. It should have felt like justice. But all Naomi could feel was the deep, gnawing understanding that this wasn't over. Her father was still beside her, his posture rigid, his hands flexing at his sides like he was still trying to force himself to stay in control. Naomi had spent her whole life watching him navigate this world, had seen the way he carried himself in rooms full of men who hated him for what he had accomplished. He had never let them see him sweat. Never let them catch a crack in the armor he had spent years building. But today, she could see it. The barely contained rage still simmering beneath the surface. The exhaustion that came with knowing there would always be another fight. Elijah exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting to Principal Marshall, who still stood awkwardly at the edge of the crowd, looking as if he wanted nothing more than to disappear into the ground beneath him. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin line, his entire body tense with the weight of his own cowardice. Naomi could see the moment he realized there was nowhere left to hide. Her father's voice was steady, controlled, but there was an undeniable edge to it, a sharpness that made even the teachers flinch. How long? Marshall blinked, his throat bobbing as he struggled to find his voice. How long, what? Elijah's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. How long have you known? Marshall's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, he looked every bit the weak man he had proven himself to be. His mouth opened and closed, and Naomi could see the battle happening inside of him, the desperate need to come up with an excuse, to find a way to distance himself from this, to rewrite history in a way that wouldn't place him at the center of this disaster. But there was nothing left to say. The truth was already written in the silence. Naomi's voice cut through the thick tension, sharp and unyielding. You ignored every complaint. Every warning. You let him get away with it. Marshall's hands trembled slightly at his sides. I didn't know it was this bad. Elijah let out a low, humorless laugh, shaking his head. His voice was lower this time, almost quiet, but the weight of it pressed down on every person standing there. You didn't care enough to find out. The words hit their target. Marshall flinched, his face twisting with something between shame and desperation, but Naomi had no patience for it. She had spent too long watching men like him pretend they weren't part of the problem, had spent too long hearing excuses from people who had been given every opportunity to do the right thing but had chosen not to. Jamal stepped forward, his voice carrying through the space with undeniable force. You knew. His eyes were locked onto Marshall, unwavering. You knew what he was. You let him do this. You let him do this to all of us. A murmur ran through the students again, a ripple of voices rising in agreement. Naomi could feel it shifting, the tide turning in real time. For so long, the silence had been their greatest weapon. It had allowed Dawson to thrive, had allowed Marshall to stand by and do nothing. But now, that silence was breaking. And there was nothing Marshall could do to stop it. I'll resign, Marshall blurted suddenly, as if that would somehow absolve him. Elijah didn't react. Didn't even blink. His gaze was locked onto Marshall, steady, unreadable. Good. Naomi saw the way Marshall's face crumpled, the way his body seemed to shrink under the weight of it. But she didn't feel sorry for him. Not now. Not ever. Because this wasn't about him. It had never been about him. She turned to her father, something unshakable settling into her chest. What happens now? Elijah studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm. Now, we make sure this never happens again. Jamal stepped closer, his hands clenched into fists. How? Naomi glanced at the students around them, at the ones who had been afraid to speak before, at the ones who had suffered in silence. And then she turned back to her father, her voice unwavering. We don't stop. Her father exhaled slowly, as if measuring the weight of those words. And then, for the first time since this all started, he nodded. You sure you're ready for that? Naomi didn't hesitate. Yes. Because this wasn't just about what had happened today. This wasn't just about Dawson. This was about every time someone had been forced to stay quiet. Every time someone had been told to accept injustice because fighting back wasn't worth the cost. Every time people like Dawson had walked away unscathed. She wasn't just going to survive. She was going to make sure no one else had to fight this battle alone again. The fallout from that day rippled far beyond the walls of Brookside High. The footage of Dawson being arrested had spread like wildfire, not just through the school, but across the entire town. News outlets picked it up within hours, the headlines flashing across screens with an urgency that made it impossible to ignore. A white police officer sets fire to a black student's hair. Caught on camera. The son of the police chief. Justice served in real time. It became a national conversation overnight, sparking debates, outrage, and, for the first time in a long time, accountability. Dawson's career was over. That much was certain. But it wasn't just about his job anymore. The charges against him were severe: assault of a minor, reckless endangerment, hate crime allegations stacking against him as civil rights organizations got involved. His defense crumbled quickly. The usual excuses, the usual shields, the usual way these things went, none of it worked this time. Too many eyes were watching. Too many people had seen the truth for themselves. The footage of him striking the match, the smirk on his face as Naomi's hair went up in flames, the utter lack of remorse in his expression, it left no room for misinterpretation. The court of public opinion had already decided. Now, the legal system had no choice but to follow. At his trial, Dawson barely looked like the man who had once ruled the school with an iron grip. He sat hunched, stripped of his uniform, stripped of his power, stripped of the arrogance that had once made him so untouchable. He had thought his connections would save him, had thought the same system that had protected him for years would work its magic once again. But when the judge read the guilty verdict, when the sentence came down harder than anyone expected, the reality finally set in. He wasn't special. He wasn't above the law. He was just another criminal. But the justice didn't stop with him. Principal Marshall's resignation wasn't enough. The community demanded more. An internal investigation revealed just how many complaints had been buried, how many students had been dismissed, how many stories had been ignored. The school board had no choice but to clean house. More resignations followed. New policies were put in place. New oversight committees were formed. Brookside High would never be the same again. For Naomi, the months that followed were a whirlwind. She had never wanted to be the face of something this big, had never planned on being a symbol. But the choice was made for her. Interviews. Rallies. Legal meetings. Everywhere she went, people recognized her. They called her brave. They called her an inspiration. But the truth was, she hadn't done any of this for recognition. She had done it because it had to be done. Because no one had ever done it before. Because if she didn't fight, nothing would change. She got into every college she applied to. The letters came in one after the other: Harvard, Stanford, Howard, Yale. Full rides. Scholarships in her name. Organizations reaching out, offering her platforms to speak, offering her opportunities that felt surreal. But the decision had already been made in her heart. She was staying. At least for now. There was still more work to do, still a fight that wasn't finished. Jamal became her partner in that fight. Together, they pushed for more than just justice for themselves. They created a student coalition, one that demanded real action, real reform, real consequences for the systems that had let Dawson and people like him thrive for so long. And for the first time in Brookside's history, the students had power. Real power. Elijah Carter, the man who had built his career on doing things the right way, the patient way, the strategic way, finally allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, change was possible now. He had spent years playing by the rules, years maneuvering through a system that had never been designed for men like him to win. But seeing his daughter stand in front of a crowd, speaking with a conviction so unshakable that even the most hardened skeptics had no choice but to listen, he knew the future belonged to her. To her generation. To the ones who wouldn't accept silence as an option. As for Dawson, he wasn't heard from much after his sentencing. Reports surfaced about his life behind bars, how the very system he had once weaponized against others now saw him as just another inmate, how the power he had clung to so desperately had been reduced to nothing. No more badge. No more authority. No more control. Just the consequences of his own actions, playing out in real time. And Naomi? Naomi thrived. She wasn't just the girl who had survived an act of cruelty. She wasn't just the daughter of the police chief. She wasn't just the student who had been at the center of a national scandal. She was more. She was power. She was proof that change was possible. That justice wasn't just a distant dream. That sometimes, the ones who try to break you end up being the reason you rise even higher than before. And as she stood in front of a crowd of students, delivering a speech that would mark the beginning of an entirely new era at Brookside High, she felt it in her bones: this was just the beginning. Now, let's talk about what this story really means. How many times have we seen people like Dawson get away with things like this? How many times have we heard stories about injustice, about cruelty, about power being used as a weapon instead of a responsibility? And how many times have we believed that nothing would change? This story isn't just about Naomi. It isn't just about Dawson. It's about every single person who has ever been told to stay silent. Every person who has ever been humiliated, mistreated, or pushed down just because they dared to exist in a space that wasn't built for them. But here's the thing: power doesn't belong to the people who abuse it. It belongs to the ones who refuse to give up. So ask yourself this: what would you have done if you were Naomi? If you were one of those students standing in that courtyard, watching it all unfold? Would you have stayed quiet? Would you have turned away? Or would you have found your voice? Because in the end, that's what really matters. Not just this story. Not just one act of justice. But the fight that continues long after the headlines fade. If this story made you feel something, if it made you think, if it made you realize that you have a voice that deserves to be heard, then don't just walk away from it. Talk about it. Share it. Be part of the change. And if you want more stories like this, if you want to hear about moments that shock, inspire, and leave an impact, subscribe to Tales of Twist. Because we're not just telling stories. We're making sure they're never forgotten.